Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Welcome to the Urban Agenda. On this edition of the Urban Agenda, our subject is the young people in our city, the thousands of 16 to 24-year-olds who are not in school and not employed, sometimes referred to as disconnected youth. We are joined today by New York Daily News columnist Errol Louis, Peter Williams, Vice President at CUNY's Medgar Evers College, and Jim Morley, Associate Director of the community-based not-for-profit Pius XII. Welcome to the Urban Agenda.
Thank you.
We wanted to bring you together actually to talk about a series of reports that are scaring us to death. We found recently that New York City has another honor. We have perhaps the largest number of disconnected youth, as we describe it, kids who are neither in school, or young adults who are neither in school or have a job. And it amounts to 170,000 of them, 16% of the youth population. And we're trying to get a fix from each of you as to what the implications of something like that and what's going on here. Maybe I'll start with you, Jim. You're sort of, on the ground, serving young people.
On the ground in the Bronx. Well, what's going on here is not a new trend. I think maybe the first thing I want to say is that there's more attention to it now because of reports. I think it's been like this way for a while, and it's going to continue this way for a while. We have large numbers of kids who do not get out of high school, and that number has been consistent. Maybe even it's growing. I think with the increase of standards and the needs to pass more regions, which is probably a good thing in some ways, but it also puts barriers for kids who are struggling. And more young people are making the option that I'm not going to make it and I'll drop out. So we service them in a number of ways, but we see that as a growing number of kids. And oh, by the way, they're all minority children, if that's a surprise to anybody. It's a real serious problem in the city.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's sort of coming out in dribs and drabs. Our report comes out, and then the chancellor of the city a few weeks ago, I guess, mentioned that about 23 of the city's high school has zero graduation rate, zero kids getting a Regents. And then, I go out and visit Thomas Jefferson out in Brownsville, and you have 1,000 kids over age who are stuck. They can't get out. They don't have some Regents courses even being taught at the school. And I'm wondering, we're in the midst of a political race, contested, and I don't hear this coming out. I don't know what,
Well,
you're seeing a lot of this.
To a great extent, where you're talking about the school system in particular,
right.
The way it's talked about politically, if you really push the chancellor and you kind of lay the statements out one by one and you go out to a lot of the press conferences, you see that what the mayor and the chancellor have in mind really is to sort of go further down to 5th grade, 3rd grade, even earlier, really. And they won't come out and say that they've basically written off a generation of kids, but the reality is that what they think works, smaller classroom sizes, special enrichment, ending social promotion and so forth, that really applies to children in elementary school. It really doesn't address this question of what you do at the end of the process when there are kids who are about to go out into the workforce and clearly aren't equipped, aren't going to college, probably aren't even going to community college, and are in fact, just kind of a part of the city that we have failed. And there's not really a clear plan on what to do about them.
I look at it from the perspective that we have disconnected communities. And if you overlay where these kids come from, we have 7 communities that produce 75% of the incarcerated population in the state. Let's look at East New York, for example. You have about 41% of the adults over age 25, based on 2000 census data, do not have a high school diploma. So, first of all, they can't help their children with their homework. They cannot be advocates. So you have a level of disconnection there. You have also public policy historically around economic development in the city that has ignored low and moderate income communities. All this development that went on in the 70s and the 80s with the UDAG grants, Urban Development Action Grants, was a grant from the city government, from federal government to the city, and a loan from the city to developers, was based on pockets of poverty. And the payback was supposed to go back in low and moderate income communities to build there. So there's been a total disconnect. And then the last issue that I think we should look at is, since we have not come back since the 1977 crisis, financial crisis in the
terms of
city.
jobs.
And when I was a kid, I had PAL, I had after-school programs to
St.
be
John's
connected.
Community Center, right?
And Dinkins, it kind of came back, but it was a slow cut. And then the last piece in terms of disconnected, there were summer jobs. Everybody in my public housing development, as a kid, we worked. So even for connected kids, kids who are in school, before they become disconnected, there's no sense of work.
You know what I'm getting a sense, however, that there may be a sense among certain individuals in the city or people in power that we can ignore this problem. I'm intrigued because we're starting to see this isn't static because of certain decisions that are going on. We're going to see sharp increases. This is just the beginning.
But I don't think they've ignored. I mean, I take issue with what you said with the chancellor because I think at least they've told the truth. I think this chancellor is different than the others. They have told the truth. This has been going. That's what I started to say before. I've been in the schools like Stevenson, Walton, Roosevelt, and the Bronx. This has been going on for 25 years, and this is the first administration that's told the truth about it and at least tried to break up these schools. Now, I will grant you at ground level, it's ugly. You cannot take schools of 4,000 and break them into small schools without lots of collateral damage. But I do think there's at least a willingness to admit that something has to be done, and first attempts to get at it. I think the other thing I would want to say, I know the numbers are huge, but I think a lot of times we hear those numbers and we say we've got 120,000 of this.
Right.
But if you actually go and look at what the this is, you'll find an incredible range of talent. You'll find kids who can come in and get a GED in 2 months and go on to college. And you'll find kids who've been in school for high school for 4 years and have 1 credit. You know, kids drop out, young people drop out for lots of reasons. And I think what we have to move toward is giving them lots of different options. And what we find is if you put something out on the table that they'll go to, they will move toward it. They are not just sort of laying there lost, but we have to be tremendously more aggressive with money, time, and talent to go after this population and educate them.
It's really a tough town to try and go into the labor market in New York. And the one interesting part of your report showed that the rates are higher here in New York than anywhere else in the country. So one reason I talked with the Census Bureau and asked them what they thought was going on with this. And one of the things they said was, to an extent that's not really matched elsewhere in the country, entry-level jobs, job as a waiter, job as a cook, so forth, those are being taken by incredibly overqualified, talented people who are here because they want to be an actor. You know, they want to be an actress. They're au pairs or whatever. You know, they've got a great deal of social capital, a great deal of education, and they're taking what would normally be entry-level jobs.
The other thing we found was one that shocked me. One of the unintended impacts of welfare reform, there are a lot of intended, was that it pushed into the labor market a large number of young women. And even if they had young children, they had to go work.
Right.
And we find that employers, both in Black and Latino communities and mid-size and larger, were attracted more to young women, particularly for service jobs, because of their customer reaction. Because what it takes to survive as a Black and Latino male in the streets of New York is not something that necessarily goes well in terms of counter relationships. And there was a displacement that I think none of us understood that is now becoming, in some respects, permanent. And if you look at most of the service jobs, increasingly you see fewer and fewer Black and Latino young men taking those jobs and be offered those jobs, and women taking those positions. And literally sort of bumping down, as opposed to all boats lifting, you're finding further pressures, particularly on young men, as they go into this. You know, my concern is, obviously, when I was Youth Service Commissioner a long time ago, in the 80s.
When we were kids, David.
Yeah, when we were kids, God almighty. We saw the remnants of actually street workers. That used to work with the gangs of the 50s going right through the 60s and early 70s. And what I'm concerned about, I'm starting to hear rumblings of the same kind of emergence coming out of this group. That as they don't see any way out, and if there are not service jobs to take, and if there are no manufacturing jobs to take, are we going to see things that the public thought was long gone? Are we going to see, everyone's been crowing about crime cutbacks, but everyone knows that the principal driver of crime generally is among young men who don't have any visible means of support. This happened for the Irish and the 5 points, 150 years ago, and clearly we don't think we're exempt, but that's what I'm starting to get concerned of. And the question is, does the public recognize that this is not stable if you don't address it?
What's interesting is that because it has been done in the past. I mean, you mentioned the Irish. I mean, there was, and there's actually some scholarship on this, there was a concerted, specific effort to convert those rowdy Irish kids into the peacekeepers, into the cops,
right.
To sort of take kids who would ordinarily gravitate toward a gang.
Right.
And, it was kind of a combination of the Catholic Church and the authorities, and they kind of made it happen over the course of a generation. I mean, even now, one of the more interesting things, I used to work in financial services at the community level. There is one particular job that's actually a growth field where, sort of mouthy, street smart kids actually are needed and can do a good job, is in collections. Every credit card company, that's one
They're
phone
going to be
call.
calling me.
Well, I'll tell you, that's one phone call you want to make where, the person's not going to be turned away with a sob story. The person's going to sound as if they really mean business. There's some possibilities here. We just have to be creative about it.
But I think there are some sectors that we can look at in the city, the healthcare field, that we need nursing. A male nurse does very well. We got to start directing these young youth males to some of these sectors and try to develop the career ladders, to make sure that they're included. One thing I get from kids who are going through the GED program is, what's next? Yeah. And the kids want to work. For example, the 21st Century Foundation came out with a report basically stated that young males are looking for entrepreneurship and self-employment. To me, that says that young males are saying, black males are saying, we have given up on the labor market as a way of employment, as a way of putting something in my pocket. So we're going to have to really focus on how can we show them some growth sectors and put their face that they can see themselves in this sector and being fully employed.
We'll be right back to continue the urban agenda.
Once you see the world through math and science, you'll never see anything the same way again. Go to girlsgotech.org.
You'll see.
We're talking about the thousands of 16 to 24-year-old young people in New York City who are not in school and not employed. Okay, we've been talking about all the negatives, and obviously, particularly in my profession, we generally wail a lot. Let's talk about what we could do and be fiscally responsible and actually have a fix. And I'll start with you, Jim. What do you see? What seems to work to move this along?
I think what works for these young people is the same thing that works for you or for myself. When we have services that are aligned with who we are and how we live, we use those services. And the example I always use is banking. Now, if you want to go and do your banking today, you can do banking 24 hours. 25 years ago, if you wanted to do banking, you did banking between 9 to 3. Yeah. When do we do schooling? We have a system that is only beginning now to become flexible for young people who, at 18, 19, 20 years old, have children themselves. When can they go to school? How easy do we make them to go to school? What about making school schedules fit kids' lives? And then the other thing, to follow the banking example, if you see the bank ads, they'll always advertise, we're personal, because people don't like an impersonal system. So what about making our schools more personal, smaller, more responsive, having young people earn credits in shorter sections of time rather than longer? There are a lot of sort of pedestrian, but if you look at the way we do education, it's very rigid. Take a course, you pass it or fail it, you go to the school for 6 months and you get a product, you don't get it. Why not do a course that lasts like they do in master's programs, very intense, for 6 weeks? Get a credit then, get your next credit. So there are a lot of practical solutions, I think, that, and the fact that we don't have them reflects how little thought has gone into what these young people need and what they will respond to. I mean, I think, in thinking about this program, the one thing I wanted to say is that we have run about 5 different types of programs: mentoring programs, counseling programs, recovery programs, GED programs. all of them sort of put out a product. And my experience has been when you put out the product right, you get a tremendous response. This group of young people will respond to an education service that can teach them. They'll work hard, they'll show up, but you have to drive at them and break down really their experience at this point, which has been so negative.
What about you, Pete? You obviously, Medgar Evers in the center of Bedford-Stuyvesant, dealing with a lot of kids who
Well, I
fall
think
into
two
this.
areas. One is increasing year-round employment, that there's subsidized employment for these kids. So then there's a connection between doing well in school and also being employed later on in life. And there's a better connection to employers within the city. Two is really developing infrastructure within the community and strengthening the communities and starting at home, really developing a strong family literacy program. So then parents also can also get their degrees, move on, but also be parent advocates, work with the kids, make sure the kids are learning, make sure that the algebra and the English is on par. So then the parent can be an advocate, navigate the system for them. I think, to me, that's a big area where you have parents who are not informed, are not strong advocates.
It's a very complicated system.
You know, we did a survey of low-income New Yorkers. We've begun to do that every year because I realized who in the hell are you talking to your own constituents?
Yeah.
And we did the last one in August of last year, and one of the things that came through was incredible support for a return to technical and vocational education. Like 93% said they wanted it in the system, and 90% of those people with kids in the system wanted it.
Absolutely.
And you know, I don't get a real sense that that's been on the agenda even as a major focus of the education system, you know, for years. But I'm getting the sense that other parts of the nation have made this, you know, with very diverse, you know, populations, are recognizing that there better be something for kids who are not immediately ready to go to college.
Right.
Any connection to work
Seems to work.
Yes. The kids they live in the environment, can't find a better word, but the bling bling world. And I think as much the pressures to work, the pressures for image is much harder with these children. And the more connections we have to work, the more opportunities for them, and many of them their lives are much more complicated than ours. So any connections to employment, and also they have this other world that's pressuring them in terms of the negative world to make money.
And it really is another world. You're exactly right.
I'm going to Rikers Island tomorrow, and I've been going up to Rikers Island. And we want to develop a program. We have a program at Medgar Evers College where we work with kids coming in on Rikers Island. I'm trying to push the city. I want these kids coming in on Rikers Island to have a job, subsidized job, and we work on them to get the GED at the same time. Because if we don't provide them with some sense of income, that's the reason why they're in jail right now.
What happens is the old vocational education that you'd find in a high school has kind of been outsourced. So now it's in these little trade schools, these little technical schools, many of which do a lousy job, frankly. Some do a questionable job, some do an awful job. Then you've got community colleges, which actually are still very good at picking up where the schools maybe trail off and start steering those who come into the system towards real employment. And then finally, and these are, I think, one of the bright spots that I think are going to be really helpful, are groups like Project Strive up in East Harlem, which really just try and connect somebody with a job. They don't spend a lot of time on skills training. They do some of the soft skills to make sure people know how to show up on time, follow instruction, come dressed properly for work. But really beyond that, they really just try and get people energized and into the workforce and into the interview process.
Well, I think we need structure. These kids are asking for structure in their lives, and to have respect, and to learn how to behave properly and to move along the system. There's no bridge for these kids right now.
They have very little experience. I like your description of the bling bling world. A lot of kids just live in that world. They don't know the other world, and there's nothing. They have a lot of talent.
It's very similar to when I was growing up in Crown Heights. There were kids who had not been outside a 5-block radius. And I go back to my old block, and you still see the same problem, that they don't have any interface with anything beyond a very narrow group, and they're rather concerned, and some of them seriously concerned, about moving, yeah, sure, go over there.
No. A lot of them really, I think, believe that they're dumb. they've got very little reinforcement from that outside world that they're smart. And I think that's why a job is so important, because a person's talents.
But that's also why educational attainment within the family is important.
Yeah.
That's also why it's important that a parent can sit down and help out a child with third grade math, etc. And the parent, if the parent hasn't attained that, if the parent has the same feeling,
Right.
it goes right back. You have to, some of these parents went to the same public schools.
Right.
They're not failing their children. Or you have a good public school within the district and a good 1 to 4, whatever, and then junior high school, middle school is terrible.
Right.
But you don't have strong parents. I worked in the dropout prevention program when I first got out of grad school. And the administrators were telling the parents that your children are learning. The kid would do something wrong, and then they bring out the child's rap sheet in front of the parent and say, well, you know,
Can't do this, can't do
you
that.
can't do that. Or the parent had a complaint against the teacher, and the rap sheet came out. There was no real advocate for the parent. The parent is not an advocate for the child because the parent doesn't know herself or himself how to navigate the system, and they've been failed by the same junior high school or grade school.
But what do we do about the other issue beginning to emerge, where the intense competition for even the most minimal jobs are improving? Obviously, New York is a major post for immigrants coming in. The elderly, because Social Security is not covering it. I
That's
saw
right.
some figure, 50% of the elderly now, their
work.
sole source of income is Social Security, and many of them are taking jobs that used to
Right.
be young people's jobs. I mean,
You see
and
that a lot, even around anywhere.
then I see McDonald's is planning
McDonald's,
to outsource its drive-through window to other parts of the world because it's all computerized, and why use people there at a higher wage? They're using, I thought that was, you know, you couldn't move the drive-in window, but they're moving it too. So I'm wondering that we're obviously dealing with an economy that's racing ahead and trying to cut costs at all corners, and where do these young people fit?
Well, we're probably in the worst city because in terms of a global economy, we are the global city, international city, so we have that competition. I think we're going to have to really define what sectors are the best sectors within New York. In every community, you have growth sectors. The growth sector, and I keep on harping, and we're focusing on the health sector, because that's the only sector that really did well, based on your report, during the recession.
Yep.
Yeah, this is. I mean,
You know,
this is.
so we got to start looking
Yeah,
at
those.
This takes a lot of smarts. I mean, there are a lot of jobs in food processing
Right.
in New York City that people just don't know about, but those are pretty good jobs. There's Blue Ridge Farms out in East New York, a number of different places like that. You've also, though, you've got people who probably could be working on if we put together some of these reverse commuter projects. There are jobs that are going
did
wanting
that.
in the suburbs,
I
you
know,
know,
I
and
did
if you
that,
could load
actually.
people on a bus
right.
or on a train and get them out to to Westchester, Dutchess.
There's also no coordination. I was meeting in one of the representatives of all things, the Cab Council. Apparently, there's an incredible need for cab drivers because it's shifted off, and they have cabs sitting in the garages now, and they're saying we can't find anybody. I didn't know that, but I feel that in some ways a city administration is going to have to step up and begin to coordinate these efforts.
But see, the problem is we focus on economic development in New York City has been brick and mortar. Economic development in New York City has not been human capital development. It hasn't been workforce development. We have the worst workforce development system in the country. When I worked for Betsy Gotthard, we started doing some analysis. In LA, they had 25 workforce development centers, one-stops. We had one at that point. We have 3 now.
Right.
So the other area that we should really look at, we're focusing on something called custom brokers and how international trade is. And there's like 300,000 jobs going to be available in the next 4 to 5 years. So there are growth sectors with all the ports in this area. There are growth sectors that we are not looking at. If you have a real estate development focus by the administration, not a human development and a workforce development focus, you have problems.
Well, I think we've sort of laid out the agenda. I think it's going to take a while, but thank you very much. My thanks to our guests.
Thank you.
New York Daily News columnist Errol Lewis, Peter Williams, Vice President at CUNY's Medgar Evers College, and Jim Morley, Associate Director of the community-based non-for-profit organization Pius XII. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society, and thank you for watching The Urban Agenda. To learn more about the work of the Community Service Society of New York or to comment on the Urban Agenda, please contact us at 212-614-5425 and on the web at www.cssny.org.